Aditya Dental College lecture class in dental anatomy. Today's class will be the difference between deciduous and permanent dentition. So the deciduous dentition is different from permanent dentition at the level of crown, root, pulp, and there are also histological differences between the two. So these are the various differences at the level of crown. So going on to the color, the deciduous tooth appear more bluish white in color compared to the permanent tooth, which is grayish white. And the deciduous tooth are also called as milk tooth because of the refractive index, which is equal to the milk, that is equal to 1. And coming to the duration, deciduous dentition starts from birth and it extends to around 12 years of age, whereas permanent dentition erupts at 6 years and continues till lifetime. And the number of deciduous teeth is around 20 in number, whereas in permanent it is 32. And the deciduous tooth appears smaller in size, and it is half the size of the permanent tooth. Next is the mesiodistal measurement, which is more than cervico-occlusal in case of deciduous dentition, and in permanent dentition the mesiodistal width is lesser than the cervico-occlusal width. And the deciduous incisors are usually cup-shaped and the deciduous molars are square-shaped. Going on to canines, the deciduous canines are more slender and conical, whereas the permanent canine is less conical. And the deciduous molars are more bulbous and it is constricted sharply at the cervical end, whereas the permanent molars are less constricted at the cervical line. Next is the cervical ridge. In the deciduous molars it is more prominent, whereas in permanent molars it is flat and it is less pronounced. And in deciduous tooth, the facial and the lingual surface converge occlusally, resulting in formation of a narrow occlusal table, whereas in case of permanent tooth the occlusal table is wide. And the occlusal plane of deciduous tooth is more or less flat, whereas in permanent tooth it is curved. And going on to the enamel, the enamel of the deciduous tooth is thin and it is consistent throughout, whereas in permanent tooth it is thick and it is approximately 1 to 2 mm in thickness and it varies. Next is the enamel rods. So in deciduous tooth, the enamel rods near the cemento-enamel junction is occlusally curved, whereas in the permanent tooth it slopes apically. And the contact area of the deciduous tooth is flat, broad, and it is more gingivally placed, whereas in case of permanent tooth, it is more occlusally placed and it is smaller in size. Next is the supplementary grooves, which are more in case of deciduous tooth and lesser in case of permanent tooth. Next is the root. So going on to the morphology of the root, it appears short and bulbous in the deciduous tooth compared to the permanent tooth. Next is the dimension. So the root is narrower mesiodistally compared to the permanent tooth. And next is the root trunk. So the furcation is placed more towards the cervical region in the deciduous tooth, and this makes the root trunk really small. Whereas in case of permanent tooth, the furcation is placed more apically and hence the root trunk is large. Next is the root flaring. So the root flares apically in the deciduous dentition so that it can accommodate the permanent molars, whereas in case of permanent tooth the flaring is not very prominent. Next is the physiological resorption. So deciduous tooth undergoes resorption during the eruption of the permanent tooth and shedding of the deciduous tooth, which is absent in case of the permanent dentition. Next, moving on to the pulp. The pulp chamber of the deciduous tooth is much larger in relation to the crown size, whereas in permanent it is smaller in size, and the pulp outline follows the dentino-enamel junction more closely in case of deciduous dentition, and in permanent it follows less closely. Next is the pulp horn, which is located close to the surface in case of the permanent dentition, and the pulp canals, which are ribbon-like and thin and tortuous in case of deciduous dentition, and in permanent dentition it is well defined. Next is the thickness of the dentine above the pulp chamber is lesser in case of deciduous dentition and more in the permanent dentition. And the floor of the pulp chamber is more porous in deciduous dentition with numerous accessory canals, whereas in case of permanent dentition it is not so porous. And the cellularity and vascularity and the repair potential is much higher in case of deciduous dentition compared to the permanent dentition. Moving on to the histological differences, the inflammatory response of the deciduous dentition is very good, whereas in case of permanent dentition, you have more of calcifications. And the nerve endings of the deciduous dentition lie close to the odontoblastic process, whereas in case of permanent dentition, it enters a predentine. And the density of innervation is more in permanent dentition, and the localization of infection is also more in permanent dentition compared to the primary dentition, and the rate of reparative dentine formation is again more in the permanent dentition compared to the deciduous dentition. So with this we come to the end of today's class. Thank you.